of the difference between long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and disequilibrium in the classical view of a macroeconomy. So again, we have the classical economist believes that in the long run, aggregate supply is going to be fixed because it's going to be fixed at the level of full employment. In other words, in the long run, we are going to get to a place where all factors of production are being used to their fullest extent. Markets are self-correcting. We always reach equilibrium in all those markets. Therefore, we will always reach equilibrium in the economy. And that means that what we're going to supply is going to be fixed. Potential GDP is going to be fixed at a point where, potential GDP will be fixed by the amount of and quality of resources. In the short run, we may be somewhere off of potential full employment. In other words, looking over here again, in the short run, we may be at point B, or we may be at point A, but we might not be efficiently producing in the short run. But in the long run, we're always going to come back to the production possibilities curve. Long run aggregate supply is the same as the production possibilities curve in a sense. This is a situation, we looked at an inflationary gap a second ago. This is a situation where we actually have what we call a deflationary gap. For any number of reasons, we find that GDP is actually at a point below what we consider full employment. We know that because we see that an unemployment rate is up, or there are factories that are not operating, or there are other resources not being used to their fullest extent. When resources aren't being used to their fullest and most efficient extent, we're somewhere inside the PPC. In other words, we're somewhere here, and I've just labeled it GDP. The average price level here, this is our short-run equilibrium. But the interesting thing here is that when resources are not being used to their fullest extent, when there is a surplus of any product, in other words, there's more of a product, there's more of a product than there is more quantity supplied than there is quantity demanded. There are people not working, for example. If there are people not working, in other words, there's more people who want jobs than there are jobs to be had, wages will come down, right? There's a pressure on wages to come down. Well, okay, so if wages fall, wages are a factor of production. The price of labor is a determinant of short-run aggregate supply. If the price of labor goes down, it's going to be cheaper and easier to produce output at the same average price levels. In other words, short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. At certain average price levels, suppliers across the economy are going to want to produce a greater quantity. So short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. When it shifts to the right, we notice that we actually get an increase in GDP and a decrease in price level. Right? The prices have come down. GDP has increased. Now, there's still a little bit of a gap here, but we can envision that the market forces that keep driving prices down are still at work, and we're actually going to continue driving prices down, prices of resources down. Short-run aggregate supply is going to continue to shift until finally we will find ourselves right here. Short-run aggregate supply 2 is now we're back to GDP potential, or in other words, full employment. So here's what we call a deflationary gap. It's the same as the inflationary gap in the same video, in the previous video, except we're looking at when the economy is underemployed as opposed to overemployed. Here's a case where resources are not being used to their fullest capacity. Resource prices then will be forced to come down because of surpluses in all those markets. As they come down, more of them will be employed. Short-run aggregate supply will shift. In other words, we're always coming back to the long-run aggregate supply. In the long run, the macroeconomy will fix itself and always come back to potential output. Now, the question is, how long does this process take? How long will it take for these markets to adjust? Right? And that's where we look at what we call Keynesian economics. Keynes believed that markets don't adjust nearly as quickly as we think they might, and therefore the classical view is flawed. But that's for the next video.